The Pacific Ocean. Dawn, June 4, 1942. Northwest of a tiny coral atoll called Midway, the most powerful carrier strike force ever assembled in the history of naval warfare, sits in the morning light. 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of aircraft, thousands of men. The cream of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the force that had begun the Pacific War at Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, and had not lost a single engagement since. On the bridge of the carrier Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo watches his aircraft disappear into the dawn sky. 108 planes climbing in tight formations, heading southeast toward Midway. He is confident. He has every reason to be confident. This force has destroyed American air power at Pearl Harbor, sunk British carriers in the Indian Ocean, swept the Dutch and Australian navies aside in the waters of Southeast Asia. There is nothing in the Pacific that can stop what he commands. He believes this morning is the beginning of the end of American resistance in the Pacific. He is wrong. 300 miles away, aboard the USS Enterprise, a young American dive bomber pilot named Wade McCluskey is studying a map that shows exactly where Nagumo's carriers will be, what course they will be on, what his aircraft will be doing at the moment of attack. He knows this because a group of American codebreakers in a basement in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, have spent the past 3 months reading Japan's most secret naval communications. They decoded the attack plan. They decoded the target. They decoded the date, the composition of the fleet, and the timing of the strike. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the American Pacific Fleet, had 6 weeks to prepare his trap. He set it perfectly. At 10:25 this morning, 30 American dive bombers will appear out of the sky above Nagumo's carriers at the exact moment Japanese fighter cover has been pulled down to low altitude, chasing torpedo bombers. In 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers will be burning beyond any possibility of salvation. Nagumo will stand on the bridge of the Akagi and watch his fleet die. And in that moment, in the 6 minutes that will take everything he built and everything he believed and turn it to smoke and sinking steel, he will understand something that no Japanese admiral had understood until that morning. The battle wasn't a battle. It was an ambush. And America had been waiting for him since May. Chapter 1. The Man Who Started the Pacific War. To understand what happened to Nagumo at Midway, you have to understand what happened to him before Midway. You have to understand what it felt like to be invincible. Chuichi Nagumo was 55 years old on the morning of June 4, 1942. He was not, by training or temperament, an aviator. He had spent his career in torpedo warfare and surface combat, and his appointment as commander of Japan's First Air Fleet, the Kido Butai, the mobile carrier strike force, had been a matter of institutional seniority rather than aviation expertise. The Japanese Navy had a deep and complicated relationship with its aviators, who were technically brilliant and operationally aggressive, but who existed in a culture that still privileged the surface gunnery officers, the battleship commanders, the men who traced their doctrine back to Admiral Togo's victory at Tsushima in 1905. Nagumo was a Tsushima man in his instincts, even if he commanded aircraft carriers. He had not chosen his command, it had come to him, and in the months since Pearl Harbor, it had made him a national hero. December 7, 1941. The Kido Butai, 6 carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, 3 submarines, approached Pearl Harbor from the north under strict radio silence, guided by intelligence that placed the American battle fleet exactly where it was, riding at anchor in the morning light. The surprise was total. The damage was catastrophic. 8 battleships sunk or damaged, nearly 400 aircraft destroyed, more than 2,400 Americans killed, all achieved without the loss of a single Japanese carrier. Nagumo had not launched the attack himself. The concept was Yamamoto's. The operational planning was Commander Minoru Genda's. The strike leader in the air was Commander Mitsuo Fuchida. But Nagumo had commanded the fleet that delivered them to their launch position, and in the logic of military history, the admiral commands the victory. He came home to Japan as a conqueror. Then he did it again. In January and February of 1942, Japanese forces swept through the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies with a speed and completeness that shocked everyone who had believed in Western colonial military power. The Kido Butai ranged across the Pacific and Indian Oceans, providing air cover, striking enemy air bases, clearing the way for the invasion forces that followed. In April 1942, Nagumo led 5 carriers into the Indian Ocean, sank the British carrier HMS Hermes, sent 2 heavy cruisers to the bottom, struck the port of Colombo in Ceylon, and demonstrated that no corner of what Japan was calling its Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was beyond the reach of carrier aviation. He returned again to Japan, again untouched, again victorious. There is something dangerous about a long streak of success. It creates the illusion of invulnerability, not through arrogance necessarily, but through the natural cognitive process of updating one's beliefs based on experience. Every success confirms the pattern. Every victory suggests the pattern will continue. By the time Nagumo sailed for Midway in late May 1942, he had been part of an unbroken string of Japanese victories that stretched back 7 months without a single serious defeat. He had no reason to believe Midway would be different. He had every reason. He simply didn't know it yet. Chapter 2. The plan that contained its own destruction. The plan to take Midway was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's. Yamamoto was the commander of the combined fleet, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the most strategically sophisticated naval mind in Japan. He understood, in a way that some of his colleagues did not, that Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. The American industrial base was simply too large. Too many factories, too much steel, too much oil, too many shipyards producing too many ships. Japan's window of strategic opportunity was measured not in years, but in months. The decisive battle had to come quickly, while Japan still had the initiative and America was still recovering from Pearl Harbor. The decisive battle, Kantai Kessen in Japanese strategic doctrine, was the concept around which the Japanese Navy had organized itself since Tsushima. The enemy fleet would be drawn into a major engagement, defeated comprehensively, and the resulting strategic paralysis would force a negotiated peace before American industrial power could be mobilized. The decisive battle required American carriers, and American carriers had not been at Pearl Harbor when the Kido Butai struck. The USS Enterprise, the USS Hornet, the USS Lexington, and the USS Saratoga had all been at sea or in port elsewhere, and their absence from the Pearl Harbor attack list was the single most significant failure of the December 7th operation. Without destroying the American carriers, Pearl Harbor, however catastrophic in tactical terms, had not delivered the decisive blow. Midway was designed to remedy that failure. The plan was elegant in concept and complex in execution. A massive Japanese force would attack Midway Atoll, the westernmost American installation in the Central Pacific. Midway's strategic value was such that Nimitz would have no choice but to sortie his remaining carriers to defend it. When the American carriers appeared, the Kido Butai would destroy them. Without carriers, the Americans could not contest Japanese control of the Central Pacific. The resulting perimeter, running from Alaska through Midway, through the Central Pacific Islands to the Dutch East Indies, would be impregnable. Japan would have won the Pacific War before 1943. The plan had one weakness. It depended entirely on the Americans not knowing it was coming. Chapter 3. The Basement in Hawaii. In a basement beneath the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor, a section so sensitive it was officially designated as Station Hypo and informally known as the Dungeon, a group of American cryptanalysts were doing something Japan's naval planners considered mathematically impossible. They were reading the Japanese Navy's operational communications. The Japanese naval cipher, JN-25 in American designation, was a complex code system that combined a large codebook of 5-digit numeric groups with a separate additive key system that changed the values of those groups. To read a JN-25 message, an interceptor needed both the codebook and the current additive key. The Japanese Naval Command believed this combination made the system unbreakable in any operationally useful time frame. The American cryptanalysts disagreed. The head of Station Hypo was Commander Joseph Rochefort, a rumpled, difficult, brilliant man who was known to wear a red smoking jacket and carpet slippers while working in the dungeon, who sometimes went 3 or 4 days without sleep during critical periods, and who had developed a capacity for deep, intuitive engagement with the logic of foreign codes that went beyond what formal cryptanalytic training could produce. He had spent years studying the Japanese language and Japanese military culture, and he approached Japanese codes not just as mathematical puzzles, but as communications produced by a specific organization with specific habits and specific purposes. He was, in effect, learning to think like the Japanese Navy. His team, which included Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, who could hold more simultaneous cryptanalytic threads in his mind than most people could manage sequentially, and Lieutenant Commander Wesley Wright, whose mathematical instincts complemented Dyer's memorization capacity, had been working on JN-25 since before Pearl Harbor. The attack on December 7th had not surprised them as completely as it surprised the rest of the American military. They had read fragments of the operational traffic and had issued warnings, which the command structure had not acted upon with sufficient urgency. After Pearl Harbor, they worked faster. By the spring of 1942, Station Hypo was reading between 15 and 20% of current JN-25 traffic. Not all of it, and not always quickly, but enough to build a picture of Japanese operational intentions that no other intelligence source could provide. In April 1942, fragments began appearing in the intercepts that suggested a major operation was being planned for the Central Pacific. The target was referred to by the letters AF. Rochefort's team believed AF was Midway, based on contextual analysis of the surrounding traffic. But belief was not proof, and the consequences of being wrong, of deploying the entire remaining American carrier force to defend the wrong location, were potentially catastrophic. Rochefort devised a test. He arranged for Midway to broadcast a fake radio message on frequencies the Japanese routinely monitored, reporting that the atoll's freshwater distillation plant had broken down and that Midway was suffering from a water shortage. Within 24 hours, Japanese intelligence intercepted the American message and transmitted it back to Tokyo. The intercept reached Station Hypo before it reached Tokyo's assessment team. It reported that AF was suffering from a water shortage. Midway was AF. The target was confirmed. Now Rochefort needed the date. The JN-25 traffic yielded it in pieces over the following weeks. The attack date was identified as End Day, then narrowed to early June. A message from Yamamoto himself specified the end date as June 4th, with the attack to commence at 0200 Tokyo time. Another intercept confirmed the Midway invasion force would arrive on June 7th, 3 days after the carrier strike. By the third week of May, Station Hypo had assembled a picture of the Japanese operation that was, in its broad outlines, more complete than the operational plans of most of the Japanese fleet commanders who would be participating in it. Rochefort took it to Admiral Nimitz. Nimitz listened for a long time. Then he said, "You're telling me you know where, when, and with what?" Rochefort said, "We know where, approximately when, and approximately with what." Nimitz said, "Close enough." He began planning the ambush. Chapter 4. The Man Who Would Set the Trap. Chester Nimitz was 66 years old in June 1942. Born in Texas, raised on the German hill country around Fredericksburg, he was a man of quiet, immovable confidence, who had spent his entire life in the United States Navy, and who had developed a leadership style, calm, analytical, enormously respectful of the men who worked for him, almost completely free of the theatrical self-presentation that characterized some of his peers, that proved exactly suited to the crisis he now commanded. He had been appointed Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet on December 31, 1941, 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, chosen by President Roosevelt over more senior officers because Roosevelt and Navy Secretary Frank Knox believed he had the temperament that the situation required. Not rage, not heroics. The ability to think clearly while everything burned. He had arrived at Pearl Harbor to find a fleet in ruins, morale shattered, and an officer corps conducting the same arguments about blame and responsibility that had been ongoing in Washington since the attack. He had toured the wreckage, listened to everything, said very little, and then told his staff, "The war is not lost. The war has barely begun." Over the next 6 months, he had reorganized, rebuilt, and reconceived the Pacific Fleet's approach to a war that would be fundamentally different from anything the pre-war Navy had planned for. The Coral Sea engagement in May 1942 had stopped the Japanese advance toward Australia at the cost of the carrier Lexington and significant damage to the Yorktown. It was not a clean victory, but it was the first time a Japanese offensive operation had been halted, and it demonstrated that American carriers, properly handled, could contest the Kido Butai on something approaching equal terms. Midway would not be equal terms. Nimitz intended to have every advantage that intelligence, preparation, and surprise could give him. He had 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the badly damaged Yorktown, which his repair crews at Pearl Harbor had restored to operational condition in 72 hours instead of the estimated 90 days. He had Midway itself as an unsinkable base, bristling with land-based aircraft that could strike the Japanese fleet without the vulnerability of a carrier. He had the Midway garrison reinforced and prepared. He had patrol aircraft extending the search radius to give maximum warning of the Japanese approach. And he had the knowledge, from Rochefort's decrypts, of exactly where the Kido Butai would be at dawn on June 4th. He positioned his carriers to the northeast of Midway, outside the Japanese search pattern, inside striking range of the Kido Butai's predicted position. He told his carrier commanders, Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher and Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, exactly what he expected. He told them, "You will be governed by the principle of calculated risk." Calculated risk meant, don't throw the carriers away on a desperate gamble, but don't hesitate when the moment comes. The moment was coming on June 4th. Nagumo didn't know any of this. Chapter 5. The Orders. Yamamoto gave and Nagumo received. The Japanese plan for Midway was, by any standard, a plan of enormous ambition and considerable organizational complexity. The overall operation involved more than 200 ships, carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, transport vessels, coordinated across several thousand miles of ocean in multiple simultaneous operations designed to achieve deception, attrition, and decisive engagement in sequence. Yamamoto's concept was layered. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands in the north would draw American attention and, hopefully, some of their carrier strength away from the Central Pacific. The main striking force, Nagumo's Kido Butai, would approach Midway from the northwest, attack the atoll to provoke the American carrier response, and then destroy the American carriers when they appeared. A massive invasion force would then take Midway, while the remnant of American naval power in the Pacific reeled from the carrier losses. Behind everything, holding back as the battle fleet reserve, was Yamamoto himself aboard the super battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built, with a fleet of surface vessels that would mop up whatever the carriers had not destroyed. It was, in concept, a masterpiece of operational design. It had 3 fatal flaws. The first was radio security. The plan required extensive coordination among widely separated forces across thousands of miles of ocean. That coordination required radio communication. That radio communication was being read by Station Hypo. Every time Yamamoto or his staff transmitted operational orders, planning updates, force compositions, or timing adjustments, Rochefort's team had a chance to read it. Not every message was decoded, but enough were decoded to give Nimitz everything he needed. The second fatal flaw was the assumption that the Americans would respond predictably. Yamamoto's plan assumed that the American carriers would appear after the initial Midway strike, drawn out by the attack on the atoll. It did not seriously consider the possibility that they might already be in position, waiting, before the first Japanese aircraft left the carrier deck. The third fatal flaw was the division of forces. The elaborate, multi-pronged plan scattered Japanese strength across an enormous area. Yamamoto's main battleship force was hundreds of miles behind the Kido Butai, too far to intervene quickly when the battle reached its decisive moment. The Aleutian diversion, while tactically executed, drew off carriers that could have been with Nagumo at Midway. Nagumo went into the battle with 4 carriers. Nimitz had 3. On paper, Japan had the advantage. In reality, Nimitz had already won before the shooting started. Chapter 6. The Night Before the Ambush. June 3, 1942. The Kido Butai steams toward its launch position, the 4 carriers cutting through the Pacific under overcast skies that have concealed their approach from American patrol aircraft. The submarines Yamamoto stationed north of Hawaii to warn him of any American carrier sortie have reached their positions too late. The American carriers had already passed through the area before the submarines arrived. The scouting report that should have told Nagumo that American carriers were at sea has not reached him. He believes the Americans do not know he is coming. He is wrong. They have known for 3 weeks. Aboard Akagi, the mood is confident. The crews have been told they are going to take Midway and then destroy the American carriers when they appear. The pilots have studied their targets and their attack profiles. The mechanics have worked through the night, ensuring every aircraft is ready for the morning's operations. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor strike, and who is sick with appendicitis but has refused to be left behind, lies in the Akagi's sickbay, furious at his own body's betrayal. He will watch tomorrow's battle from the carrier's bridge instead of leading it from the cockpit. The night passes. At 04:30 on June 4th, the Kido Butai reaches its launch position. Nagumo gives the order to launch the first wave. 108 aircraft, 36 dive bombers, 36 torpedo bombers, 36 Zero fighters begin lifting from the flight decks of all 4 carriers. The deck officers wave their flags, the engines roar. One by one, then in rapid succession, the aircraft accelerate down the flight decks and climb into the morning sky. They turn southeast toward Midway. Nagumo watches them go. He has kept half his aircraft back, his second strike wave, armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes intended for warships. Standard procedure, following Yamamoto's specific orders. Keep ship-killing weapons ready in case American warships appear. He is following his orders exactly. He has made no mistake yet. The mistake is coming. Chapter 7. Rochefort's Gift. Commander Joseph Rochefort and Station Hypo. To fully understand what Nagumo was sailing into, you have to understand the organization that had been reading his mail. Station Hypo occupied a space that was physically not impressive. A basement room beneath a nondescript building in the Pearl Harbor Naval District. Low ceilings, poor ventilation, the constant hum of IBM tabulating machines, primitive by later standards, but essential for processing the enormous volume of encoded Japanese traffic. The temperature was controlled to protect the machines rather than the people, and the people wore sweaters in Hawaii. Rochefort had built his team over years of patient institutional effort that had not always received the recognition or resources it deserved. The American intelligence establishment before Pearl Harbor was fragmented, competitive, and sometimes actively hostile to the kind of interdisciplinary collaboration that codebreaking required. Navy intelligence and Army intelligence competed. Washington and the field competed. The codebreakers and the operational commanders spoke different professional languages and sometimes drew different conclusions from the same raw intelligence. Rochefort cut through this by the force of his analytical personality and by the quality of what his team produced. He was not an easy man to work with. He was demanding, impatient with conventionality, capable of the kind of creative, logical leaps that left more systematic thinkers convinced he was either brilliant or wrong, and he was almost always right in the cases that mattered. He had enemies in Washington, specifically his relationship with OP-20G, the Navy's main communications intelligence section in Washington, was chronically poor, and those enemies would eventually, after Midway, arrange his removal from command in a bureaucratic maneuver that stands as one of the most petty acts of organizational spite in the history of American intelligence. But in the spring of 1942, before any of that, Rochefort had the right answer about Midway when Washington was uncertain, the right answer about the Japanese carrier force's composition and approach when the operational planners were debating alternatives, and the right answer about the date when every day of preparation time was worth more than any other resource Nimitz had. The AF deception having Midway broadcast the fake water shortage message, then waiting for Japanese intelligence to relay it back in JN-25 traffic, was Rochefort's idea. It is one of the most elegant pieces of operational deception in intelligence history. Using the enemy's own signals system as a verification tool, tricking the enemy into confirming the accuracy of your own intelligence assessment. When the JN-25 intercept came back reporting AF is short of water, Rochefort brought it to Nimitz with 2 words: "It's Midway." Nimitz accepted it. He had already accepted it, in all likelihood, before the confirmation. But confirmation was what allowed him to commit his remaining carriers, his last major offensive asset in the Pacific, to the ambush. The decision required a certain quality of command courage that is easy to underestimate in retrospect. If Rochefort was wrong, if AF was not Midway, if the Japanese were not coming on June 4th, if the carriers were positioned to the northeast based on faulty intelligence and the Japanese struck somewhere else, the consequences would be catastrophic. The carriers would be out of position. Midway, or another American installation, would fall. The remaining offensive capability of the Pacific Fleet would have been wasted on a feint. Nimitz accepted the risk. The acceptance was based on his assessment of Rochefort's track record, on his evaluation of the intelligence product, and on a strategic judgment that a chance to ambush the Kido Butai was worth almost any risk. He was right. Chapter 8. The Morning of June 4th. Nagumo's World. At 0600 on June 4th, Nagumo's world looks exactly as expected. His first wave is over Midway, beginning its attack. The strike commander, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, is reporting significant damage to Midway's facilities. The atoll is defended more heavily than expected. The American fighters and anti-aircraft fire have exacted some losses from the attack force, but the strike has clearly hit the target. Nagumo is monitoring the radio traffic from his strike force. He is also monitoring the search reports from his 7 search aircraft, which were launched at 0430 to scout the ocean sectors in a pattern covering the area from which American warships might approach. 5 of the 7 search aircraft are cruiser-launched float planes, slower, with shorter range and lower performance than carrier aircraft. The 6th is a Zero from one of the carriers, more capable but still limited. The 7th, launched from the cruiser Tone, has a critical mechanical problem during launch that delays it by 30 minutes. The sector that the Tone search aircraft is supposed to cover is exactly the sector where the American carrier force is waiting. The 30-minute delay in Tone's aircraft launch means that the American carriers will remain outside Japanese knowledge for 30 minutes longer than Yamamoto's search plan intended. 30 minutes. In the history of the Battle of Midway, almost everything comes back to time. Minutes matter. Not hours, not days. Minutes. And those 30 minutes, the 30-minute mechanical delay in the launch of Tone's float plane, will contribute directly to the timing of events that will determine whether Nagumo has his aircraft armed and ready when the decisive moment arrives. But this is 0600, and none of that is visible yet. At 0700, Tomonaga's strike leader sends his report. Midway needs another attack. The first strike has not knocked out the island's airfields. Nagumo must decide whether to rearm his second strike aircraft, currently sitting below decks, armed with ship-killing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, ready for anti-carrier operations, with land attack weapons for a second strike on Midway. Yamamoto's orders are explicit. Keep the anti-shipping weapons ready until the presence or absence of American carriers is confirmed. There are no American carriers confirmed. The Tone search aircraft has not yet reached the sector where they are waiting. Nagumo makes his first fateful decision. He orders the second strike aircraft rearmed with land attack bombs. Chapter 9. The Rearming. The Decision That Changed the War. The rearming order went down to the hangar decks of all 4 carriers at approximately 07:15. The hangar crews began the labor of removing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs from the aircraft and replacing them with conventional land attack bombs. It was heavy, slow work. The torpedoes were long and awkward. The bombs were stacked on trolleys and moved with equipment that, in the confined hangar spaces, required careful coordination. The crews were experienced and efficient, but the physics of the task were what they were. The rearming would take approximately 1 hour. At 07:28, 13 minutes after the rearming order, the radio room received a message from the Tone's search aircraft. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, in position bearing 010 degrees, distant 240 miles from Midway. Course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. American warships. Nagumo read the message. He sent back an immediate query. What types of ships? The Tone aircraft's response took 12 minutes. 12 minutes while the rearming continued. 12 minutes while torpedoes were pulled from aircraft and land attack bombs were loaded in their place. 12 minutes while the window for a timely anti-carrier strike was quietly closing. At 08:09, the Tone aircraft replied, "The force includes what appears to be a carrier." A carrier. There it was. Nagumo now had confirmation of the exact situation that Yamamoto's orders had anticipated. American carriers were present. His second strike aircraft, which were currently in the middle of being rearmed from anti-carrier weapons to land attack bombs, needed to be rearmed back to anti-carrier weapons. He gave the order to switch back. On the hangar decks, crews who had spent the past 50 minutes removing torpedoes and replacing them with bombs received new orders to remove the bombs and replace them with torpedoes. Some of the bombs, in the rush, were not returned to their proper storage areas. They were left on the hangar deck, on trolleys, near the aircraft, or stacked against bulkheads. This was a violation of safety procedure. Under the pressure of time and the accumulated confusion of 2 rearming orders in less than an hour, procedure was bent. Those improperly stored bombs would be a significant factor in what happened next. But Nagumo's immediate problem was time. The rearming was not complete. The first wave was returning from Midway and needed to land. Recovering aircraft while launching a strike was dangerous and complicated. Nagumo decided to recover the first wave, rearm and refuel them, and then launch a combined second strike. He turned northeast. He was recovering aircraft, and northeast of him, the American dive bombers were already in the air. Chapter 10. Wade McCluskey and the Turn That Saved the Pacific. Wade McCluskey did not find the Japanese fleet where he expected it. He was the air group commander of the USS Enterprise, leading 33 dive bombers in a search for the Kido Butai, based on the predicted position that had been calculated from the intelligence assessment and the morning's search reports. He reached the estimated position at approximately 09:20 and found empty ocean. He had been in the air for more than 2 hours. His aircraft were burning fuel at a rate that made every additional minute a calculation against the ability to return to the carrier. His pilots were young. Some of them were on their first combat mission. 33 dive bombers circling over empty ocean 400 miles from home, looking for the most powerful carrier fleet in the world that was not where the planning said it would be. He had a choice. He could turn back, conserve fuel, preserve the aircraft and the pilots, accept that the contact had been lost and return to the Enterprise for a reassessment. Or he could search. He looked at the ocean below him. He made a calculation. If the Japanese fleet had left its predicted position, it would most likely have turned to recover aircraft from the Midway strike, which meant turning northeast, away from Midway, into the wind. He turned his formation northeast and extended the search. At 09:55, he saw a white wake on the ocean below him. A Japanese destroyer, moving fast, cutting a bright line across the blue Pacific. A destroyer moving fast was almost certainly moving toward something, toward the main fleet. McCluskey followed the wake. 7 minutes later, the Kido Butai appeared below him. 4 carriers, their flight decks visible from altitude, their wakes white in the sun, surrounded by their escort of battleships and cruisers and destroyers. And something else was visible from altitude that McCluskey and his pilots could see clearly. The Japanese fighter cover, the Zeros that protected the carriers from air attack, was not high. It was low, dangerously low. Because a wave of American torpedo bombers from the Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, had just flown into the concentrated fire of the entire combat air patrol at low altitude, and every Japanese Zero had been pulled down to sea level to destroy them. All 15 of Waldron's torpedo bombers had been shot down. Not one torpedo had hit. It was a slaughter, one of the most heroic and futile attacks of the Pacific War, and it had stripped the high-altitude fighter cover from the Japanese carriers at the exact moment McCluskey's dive bombers arrived. McCluskey pushed over into his attack dive. 33 dive bombers, screaming nearly vertically toward the carriers below, the Zeros too low and too scattered to climb and intercept in time. The attack took 6 minutes. Chapter 11. 6 minutes that changed the Pacific War. The attack began at 10:25. McCluskey split his force between Akagi and Kaga, the 2 largest carriers. At almost the same moment, 17 dive bombers from the Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, rolled into their attack dives on Soryu. Nagumo was on the bridge of Akagi. He had been dealing with the chaos of recovering aircraft, rearming, and preparing for the second strike. The carrier was in the most vulnerable possible state, aircraft being refueled and rearmed on the hangar decks, fuel lines open, bombs and torpedoes in various stages of being loaded or unloaded. The improperly stored bombs from the first rearming order were still on the hangar deck. The lookouts reported dive bombers. The anti-aircraft guns opened fire. It was too late. The first bomb hit Akagi at 10:26. It penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the upper hangar, directly among the aircraft being rearmed and refueled. The aviation fuel ignited. The improperly stored bombs began to cook off. Secondary explosions tore through the hangar in rapid succession. Kaga took 3 bombs in rapid sequence. The hits were spread across the flight deck and into the hangar below, where the same lethal combination of fuel and ammunition produced the same catastrophic chain of secondary explosions. Soryu took 3 bombs that set her flight deck ablaze from stern to bow in approximately 4 minutes. 3 carriers hit in a 6-minute attack. 3 carriers burning beyond any reasonable possibility of salvation. Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge and watched his carrier begin to die. The fires were spreading forward. The secondary explosions were becoming continuous, the sound of a ship destroying itself from the inside, as ammunition cooked off and fuel lines ruptured, and the hangar deck became an inferno. Black smoke poured from the ship's interior in quantities that were visible for 50 miles. His staff pleaded with him to transfer his flag to a destroyer. He refused to move. The fires reached the bridge. They moved him by force. Nagumo transferred his flag to the light cruiser Nagata, stepping from his dying carrier to a small ship with no aircraft and no capacity to command a carrier battle. He was, in every meaningful operational sense, finished. The battle was continuing without him. His fourth carrier, Hiryu, which had survived the initial attack, was striking back. Her dive bombers found and hit the Yorktown, badly damaging her. But it was a last, convulsive response, not a reversal of fortune. By mid-afternoon, the Enterprise's dive bombers had found Hiryu and sent her the same way as the others. 4 carriers, all 4. Japan's carrier strike force, the instrument of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean, and every Pacific victory of the previous 7 months, was burning on the surface of the Pacific, north of Midway. Chapter 12. The Moment of Realization. There was a specific moment in the battle when Nagumo understood. Not when the first bomb hit Akagi. Not in the first minutes of smoke and fire, when a commander's instinct is to manage the emergency, to direct damage control, to try to save what can be saved. The moment of realization came aboard Nagata, watching Akagi burn. He could see all 3 carriers from the cruiser's bridge. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were all burning. The smoke from each was visible in a different direction on the horizon. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, was somewhere to the northeast, still intact, still fighting. He had received her initial attack report and knew she had struck the Yorktown. But Nagumo was a professional naval officer who had commanded carriers through 7 months of unbroken victory, and he could read what he was looking at. 3 carriers burning simultaneously. This was not bad luck. This was not a tactical mistake that a different decision would have prevented. This was a prepared trap, executed by an enemy who had known where his ships would be and had positioned his forces to be at exactly the right place at the right time. The dive bombers had arrived at precisely the worst possible moment for the Japanese, when the fighter cover was at low altitude, when the hangar decks were in the middle of rearming, when the carriers were recovering aircraft and moving into the wind. The probability of any single enemy commander orchestrating this combination of circumstances through tactical intuition alone was effectively 0. They had known. The Americans had known he was coming, not suspected, not guessed, known. Nagumo stood on the bridge of Nagata, watching Akagi burn, and understood the shape of what had happened. The unopposed approach across the Pacific. The American carriers already in position to his northeast when they should have been at Pearl Harbor, or too far south to intercept. The attack timed so perfectly to catch his aircraft in the most dangerous possible state. They had been waiting for him. The battle wasn't a battle. It was an ambush. He had led the finest carrier force in the world directly into a trap that had been prepared weeks in advance, and he had done so in complete ignorance, following orders that seemed sound, making decisions that seemed reasonable, commanding a fleet that seemed invincible. And now, 3 of its 4 carriers were burning. He sat down. His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, stood beside him. Neither of them spoke for a time. Then Kusaka said quietly, "What are your orders?" Nagumo looked at the smoke. He had no orders to give that would change what had already happened. Chapter 13. John Waldron and the Torpedo Bombers. To understand what McCluskey's dive bombers achieved, you have to understand the price that was paid to make their attack possible. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron commanded Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, from the USS Hornet. He was 39 years old, a South Dakotan with Native American heritage on his mother's side, who had spent his career in the Navy and who had developed a reputation as a pilot of exceptional skill and a commander of demanding standards and unusual personal warmth. On the morning of June 4th, Waldron's squadron became separated from the rest of the Hornet's air group during the flight to the target. The bombers and fighters took a different course. Waldron, navigating by his own judgment, turned in a different direction. He found the Japanese fleet. He found it without fighter escort, without the high-altitude dive bombers that would have drawn the Zero fighter cover upward, without any support of any kind. 15 Devastator torpedo bombers, obsolete aircraft that were slower than the Zeros, that could not take evasive action once they began their low-altitude torpedo runs, that depended for their survival on exactly the fighter cover that was not there. Waldron knew all of this. He led his squadron in anyway. He sent a radio message before the attack that was later reconstructed from fragmentary recordings and the memory of his radio operator, who survived because he was aboard a separate aircraft that day. My greatest hope is that we encounter a favorable tactical situation. But if we don't, and the worst comes to worst, I want each of us to do his utmost to destroy our enemies. If there is only one plane left to make a final run in, I want that man to go in and get a hit. Every one of Waldron's 15 aircraft was shot down. Not one torpedo hit. But the attack, and the similar attacks by torpedo squadrons from the Enterprise and Yorktown that followed in the next 30 minutes, pulled every Japanese Zero fighter down to low altitude. The Zeros chased torpedo planes at sea level, maneuvering at high speed to intercept the slow Devastators. By the time McCluskey's dive bombers arrived at high altitude, the combat air patrol was scattered and exhausted and low on ammunition, and too low to climb in time. Waldron's attack failed tactically. It succeeded strategically. The men of Torpedo Squadron 8, all but one of the 30 who flew that morning, died, created the conditions for McCluskey's 6-minute miracle. Their sacrifice was, in a specific technical military sense, the decisive moment of the Battle of Midway. The dive bombers got the credit, because the dive bombers delivered the killing blows, and killing blows are visible in the historical record in a way that sacrifice is not. But the sacrifice came first. Chapter 14. Yamamoto learns the truth. Hundreds of miles to the rear, aboard the super battleship Yamato, Isoroku Yamamoto was receiving the battle reports. The reports came in fragments, delayed by communication difficulties, distorted by the chaos of battle. But their shape was becoming clear. At first, the news was manageable. A strike on Midway launched, heavy American air attacks on the Kido Butai from Midway-based aircraft, all repulsed, American torpedo bombers destroyed, Nagumo preparing a second strike. Then the messages changed. Akagi hit, fires, serious damage. Kaga hit, fires, serious damage. Soryu hit, fires, serious damage. 3 carriers hit. Yamamoto sat in his operations room aboard Yamato and read the messages as they came in. His staff watched him. He was known for his composure, the same steady, analytical temperament that had devised the Pearl Harbor attack,
that had spent years calculating the odds of a Pacific War and concluding that Japan needed to fight it quickly or not at all. He did not shout. He did not rage. He did not display the emotions that the moment probably warranted. He said very quietly to his chief of staff, "How did they know where to find us?" No one in the room had an answer. The answer was in a basement in Hawaii, but Yamamoto did not know that. He would not know it for the rest of the war.
The Japanese Navy would investigate the possibility of a communications compromise after Midway and conclude that their codes remained secure. The same conclusion that the German Navy would reach after Black May, 2 months earlier. They were wrong. But they did not know they were wrong. And so they continued to send messages in a compromised code, and the Americans continued to read them. And the advantage that Midway had given the United States, the advantage of knowing the enemy's plans before the enemy executed them, continued to operate in the background of every major Pacific engagement for the remainder of the war. Yamamoto ordered the Midway invasion canceled. He ordered his surviving forces to withdraw. He turned Yamato toward Japan. The decisive battle he had been planning since December 7, 1941, the battle that was supposed to destroy American carrier power and force a negotiated peace, had destroyed his own carrier power instead. He would never attempt anything like it again. Chapter 15. The Yorktown's Last Hours. The battle was not entirely one-sided. Hughes dive bombers found the Yorktown at approximately 1200 on June 4th, scoring 3 direct hits that stopped the carrier and left her burning and listing. Yorktown's crew performed extraordinary damage control, extinguishing the fires and restoring power to the point where the carrier was making 18 knots and recovering aircraft by early afternoon. Hughes torpedo bombers then found her a second time. 2 torpedoes hit the Yorktown at 14:30, reopening the flooding, causing a list that made the ship structurally unstable, and forcing Admiral Fletcher to abandon her. The Yorktown floated for 2 more days, kept afloat by salvage crews who refused to give up on her, before a Japanese submarine found her in the early hours of June 6th and sent her to the bottom with 2 more torpedoes. The loss of the Yorktown was the American price for Midway. 1 carrier against 4.
1 carrier against 4 Japanese carriers, a heavy cruiser, over 300 aircraft, and more than 3,000 men. By any measure of military exchange ratios, the Battle of Midway was the most lopsided naval victory of the Second World War. It had been achieved by intelligence.
Chapter 16. What the Japanese didn't know, they didn't know. In the months after Midway, the Imperial Japanese Navy conducted a thorough analysis of what had gone wrong. The analysis was honest in some respects and dishonest in others. It honestly identified tactical failures, the rearming decision, the delay in Tonei's search aircraft launch, the failure to maintain adequate high-altitude fighter cover. Nagumo bore the weight of these criticisms, and not entirely unfairly. The rearming decision in particular was a violation of Yamamoto's explicit orders. It dishonestly avoided the central question. How had the American carriers been in position to intercept? The Japanese Navy's official explanation for the American carrier's presence was that Nimitz had used his submarine scouts more effectively and had received earlier warning of the Japanese approach than should have been possible. This explanation was factually wrong, but allowed the naval command to avoid the conclusion that their communications were compromised. The Enigma parallel is direct and instructive. The German Naval Command, also in 1942 and 1943, consistently refused to accept that their communications had been broken,
attributing Allied foreknowledge to agents, radar, and luck, rather than to cryptanalysis. The Japanese Navy made exactly the same error for exactly the same reason. The alternative explanation was professionally and psychologically unacceptable. Accepting that the enemy was reading your communications meant accepting that everything you had communicated was known. Every plan, every position, every resource allocation, every timing decision.
It meant accepting that your operational security, the foundation on which all planning rested, had been hollow for an unknown period. It was easier to believe in enemy luck. The Japanese Navy kept believing in enemy luck until the end of the war. They kept transmitting in JN 25. The Americans kept reading it. Chapter 17. The Consequences. Japan's Strategic Position after Midway. The loss of 4 carriers at Midway was not, by itself, a fatal blow to Japan's strategic position. Japan had other carriers. More were under construction. The remaining fleet was still formidable by any objective measure. The Japanese Army, which had been the primary driver of the Pacific War's expansionist phase, remained largely unaffected by what had happened at sea north of Midway. But Midway ended something irreplaceable. The 4 carriers sunk at Midway, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, had been the first-line vessels of the Kido Butai, built or converted specifically for fleet carrier operations, crewed by the most experienced and skilled naval aviators in the Japanese service. Their pilots had trained for years. The carrier doctrine they had developed and refined across years of operational experience was embedded in those crews and those commanders in ways that could not simply be transferred to replacement vessels. Japan could build more carriers. It could not quickly rebuild the experience. The pilots who died at Midway, more than 100 of Japan's best naval aviators, lost with their aircraft when the carrier sank or shot down in the battle, represented a loss of human capital that the Japanese training system could not replace on any operationally useful timeline. The replacement pilots who would crew Japan's subsequent carriers were less experienced, less skilled, and flying in a tactical environment that was growing more dangerous with every month of American industrial and training output. The trajectory of the Pacific Air War after Midway was almost entirely one-directional. American pilot quality improved. American aircraft quality improved. American numerical superiority increased. The margin that Japan had enjoyed in June 1941, better aircraft, better pilots, more combat experience, eroded steadily from June 1942 onward. It never recovered. The Battle of Midway did not end the Pacific War. That required 3 more years of grinding, brutal combat across thousands of islands and millions of square miles of ocean, at a cost of millions of lives. But Midway determined the direction of that trajectory. It confirmed that Japan could not win a war of attrition against American industrial power. It eliminated the option of a negotiated peace from a position of strength. It forced Japan into a defensive strategy that required holding every island, resisting every advance, spending irreplaceable human and material resources in engagements where the exchange ratios grew steadily worse. From Midway onward, Japan was fighting a war it could not win. It knew this, and it kept fighting. Chapter 18. Nimitz and the Intelligence Secret. Admiral Nimitz knew, from the moment the battle reports came in on the afternoon of June 4th, that what had happened at Midway was not primarily a military victory. It was an intelligence victory. The military victory was real. The courage of the pilots, the skill of the dive bomber attacks, The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons, the extraordinary damage control on the Yorktown, all of it was real and deserved full credit. But none of it would have been possible if Rochefort's team had not read Yamamoto's plans. Without the intelligence, the American carriers would not have been in position. Without position, there would have been no ambush. Without the ambush, the battle would have been fought on different terms that, given the relative strength of the two forces, might well have favored Japan.
Nimitz understood this absolutely. He also understood that the intelligence advantage was his greatest strategic asset, and that it would be destroyed the moment Japan learned their communications were being read. The cover story for the American victory at Midway had to be constructed carefully. The official American account attributed the carrier's prior positioning to long-range submarine reconnaissance and patrol aircraft reports, plausible explanations that accounted for the apparent prescience of Nimitz's deployment without revealing its true source. The Japanese investigators, examining the same question, reached the same plausible explanation and stopped there. Submarine scouts, better reconnaissance, luck. The real source of Nimitz's knowledge remained secret. Station Hypo continued to operate. The JN-25 intercepts continued to flow. And American commanders continued to benefit from the intelligence edge that Midway had bought, not freely, but dearly, at the cost of Waldron's torpedo squadron and the Yorktown and the men who died with them. Chapter 19. Rochefort's Fate. Joseph Rochefort's reward for giving Nimitz the intelligence that won the Battle of Midway was, in the near term, deeply unjust. His enemies in Washington, specifically a coalition of OP-20G officers who had disputed his Midway assessment and lost, and who were not inclined to forgive him for being right, moved against him shortly after the battle. They argued, in communications that carefully avoided explicit reference to the intelligence dispute, that the Pacific Theater command structure required changes. Rochefort was removed from Station Hypo in October 1942 and assigned to the command of a floating dry dock on the West Coast. It was one of the most transparent acts of bureaucratic revenge in American military history. He was nominated for the Distinguished Service Medal for his work on Midway.
The nomination was blocked by the same Washington officials who had engineered his removal. He did not receive the Distinguished Service Medal during his lifetime. In 1986, 20 years after his death in 1976, President Ronald Reagan authorized the posthumous award of the Distinguished Service Medal to Joseph Rochefort, acknowledging what the Navy had refused to acknowledge for 40 years. The award was accepted by his family. It was long overdue. Chapter 20. Nagumo's Final Years. Chuichi Nagumo survived Midway. He survived it physically, transferred from Akagi to Nagata to a destroyer as the battle collapsed around him, watching his fleet die from a succession of decks that became progressively smaller and more inadequate for a man of his rank and responsibility. He survived it institutionally, at least initially. The Japanese Navy, recognizing that admitting the full truth of Midway would damage public morale catastrophically, managed the public narrative carefully. The official announcement acknowledged a battle, a costly one, with the loss of some carriers, but framed it as an inconclusive engagement in which Japanese forces had inflicted significant damage on the enemy. The 4 carriers sunk in one morning became, in official Japanese communications, moderate losses. Nagumo was not publicly blamed. He was given other commands. He led Japanese forces in subsequent Pacific engagements, at the Philippine Sea and at the Marianas. But the man who had commanded at Midway was not the same man who had commanded at Pearl Harbor.
Something had been broken at Midway that was not merely tactical or strategic. The confidence, the deep, professionally earned confidence of a commander whose forces had not lost, was gone. In its place was something more careful, more defensive, more aware of the fragility of even the greatest military force when it meets an enemy who has read all its plans. In July 1944,
with American forces capturing Saipan and the Japanese defense of the Marianas collapsing, Nagumo was commanding the Central Pacific Area Fleet from Saipan itself. The island was falling. There was no rescue coming. The Japanese naval forces in the area had been destroyed in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. On July 6, 1944, with American troops closing in on his command post, Nagumo took his own life. He was 57 years old. The man who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and then sailed into the ambush at Midway died on a Pacific island that Americans were taking away from Japan, in a war that Midway had decided 2 years earlier. Chapter 21. The Pilots Who Died. The Battle of Midway's human cost is sometimes presented as a neat statistical comparison. 300 American dead versus 3,000 Japanese dead. The comparison is accurate and inadequate simultaneously. Numbers communicate scale. They do not communicate the specific texture of what those numbers mean, who the individuals were, what they carried with them to the Pacific, what they left behind. The men of Torpedo Squadron 8 were 29 Americans who flew into the combined fire of the Japanese Combat Air Patrol, knowing what they were flying into. Waldron had briefed them. They knew the Zeros were there. They knew their aircraft were slow. They knew there was no fighter escort. They knew what the torpedo runs required. They flew anyway. Ensign George Gay was the only pilot from VT-8 to survive. Shot down, his aircraft destroyed, he floated in the water while the battle continued overhead, close enough to watch the dive bombers turn the Japanese carriers into fires on the horizon. He was in the water for 30 hours before a rescue aircraft found him. He spent the rest of his life carrying the weight of being the only one who came back. The Japanese aviators who died were also men, pilots who had trained for years, who had the professional's mastery of a highly technical skill, who flew with absolute commitment in a cause they believed in. The Zero is not a derogatory statement about the pilots who flew the Zero fighter. They were among the finest naval aviators in the world in June 1942. They died because their commanders didn't know that the enemy knew where they were. They died because of a communications failure that ran straight from the code books in the Japanese fleet's cipher room to a basement in Pearl Harbor, where Joseph Rochefort had been reading their mail for months. They died not in battle, but in a trap. Chapter 22. The Pacific War's Turning Point. What Midway Meant. Military historians have spent 80 years arguing about whether Midway was truly the turning point of the Pacific War, or whether the grinding island campaign and the industrial output differential would have produced the same outcome regardless. The argument has merit on both sides. Japan's industrial disadvantage relative to the United States was not created by Midway. It existed before the war began, and would have expressed itself eventually, regardless of what happened at any single engagement. The argument that America would have won the Pacific War even without Midway is probably correct in the long run. But the long run has a human cost. Every month of additional war is additional dead. Every month of Japanese strategic initiative, the ability to choose where and when to attack, to extend the defensive perimeter, to force the Allies to fight on Japan's chosen ground,
means more men dying on more islands in more engagements that a shorter war would have avoided. Midway shortened the war. It shortened it by removing Japan's offensive carrier capability at a moment when that capability was still being used to expand and consolidate Japan's strategic position. Without Midway, Japan might have taken New Caledonia, cut the supply line to Australia, threatened Hawaii again,
forced the United States to fight a longer defensive campaign before it could begin the offensive that ended the war. Every one of those additional months, every additional campaign, every additional island, every additional man killed in a war that continued longer than it needed to, is part of Midway's legacy. The men who are not listed on any memorial because they were never born, because their fathers came home from a shorter war. Those absent lives are also part of what was decided north of Midway on June 4, 1942. History counts the dead. It cannot count the living who were spared. Chapter 23. The Codebreakers' Long Silence. The men and women who worked at Station Hypo and at the other American cryptanalytic centers throughout the Pacific War did not receive public recognition for their contributions until long after the war ended. The intelligence secret was maintained rigorously. After the war, many veterans of the code-breaking effort were told explicitly that they could not discuss their work. The details of how Midway had been won, the real details involving Rochefort and Station Hypo and the AF deception and the JN-25 decrypts, remained classified for decades. This created a historical distortion that persisted for a generation. The official accounts of Midway emphasized tactical heroism, which was real and deserved, and attributed American foreknowledge to patrol aircraft and submarine reconnaissance. Veterans of the battle wrote memoirs and gave interviews within the constraints of what they were allowed to say. Historians writing without access to the classified material constructed explanations that were plausible but incomplete. The distortion was not corrected until the 1970s, when the American government began declassifying wartime intelligence records, and historians finally had access to the full picture. When the true story of Midway became public, when the role of Rochefort and Station Hypo and the JN-25 decrypts became part of the historical record, it required a significant rewriting of the battle's meaning. Midway was not primarily a triumph of American naval aviation, though American naval aviation performed magnificently. It was primarily a triumph of American intelligence, organization, and the willingness of a commander, Nimitz, to act decisively on the basis of intelligence he could not share publicly and could not verify independently. The heroism was real. The sacrifice was real. But the heroism and sacrifice operated within a framework that intelligence had created, a framework that positioned American aircraft where they needed to be, at the moment they needed to be there, against an enemy that had no idea they were waiting. Chapter 24. The Men Who Built the Ambush. The ambush at Midway was built by many hands. There were the mathematicians and linguists who had spent years learning to read Japanese codes, developing the tools and techniques that eventually gave Station Hypo its capability. Their work predated the war and continued through it, patient, incremental progress made in obscurity by people whose names are not on most monuments. There were the radio intercept operators, enlisted men and women, many of them, stationed across the Pacific at listening posts that monitored Japanese communications day and night, recording every transmission, every frequency, every bearing. Their work was monotonous and essential. Without the raw intercept material,
Rochefort's team had nothing to analyze. There were the IBM tabulating machine operators who processed the encoded traffic, sorting and indexing the 5-digit code groups that made up JN25, building these statistical databases that allowed analysts to identify patterns and make cribs. There were the analysts who spent their days in the dungeon, surrounded by paper,
building the picture of Japanese naval operations from fragments of decoded traffic, incomplete information, and educated inference. There was Rochefort, who held it all together, who argued for the Midway conclusion when Washington was skeptical, who devised the AF water shortage deception, who went to Nimitz with the intelligence assessment and staked his professional reputation on it. And there was Nimitz, who accepted the risk. The ambush was not a moment. It was the product of years of work by hundreds of people who never fired a gun or flew an aircraft or watched a carrier burn. They built the trap. The pilots sprung it. Chapter 25. Raymond Spruance, the admiral who did everything right. If Nagumo represents the commander who made the fatal decisions at Midway, Raymond Spruance represents the commander who made almost no mistakes. Spruance was not an aviator. Like Nagumo, he had come to carrier command from surface warfare. Unlike Nagumo, he used his non-aviation background as an advantage. He was not constrained by the tactical instincts of an aviator, and he was willing to consult freely with his aviation staff about execution, while keeping the strategic decisions firmly in his own hands. On the morning of June 4th, Spruance made the decision to launch his aircraft at maximum range, an earlier launch than his aviation officers thought safe, given the distances involved and the fuel margins of his aircraft. He made this decision because Nimitz's intelligence assessment gave him confidence in the Japanese fleet's position, and because he calculated that the advantage of surprise, catching the Japanese carriers in the middle of recovering their first-wave aircraft, was worth the risk of extended flight times. He was right. The launch timing placed McCluskey's dive bombers over the Japanese carriers at the moment when the combat air patrol had been drawn down to low altitude by the torpedo squadrons. A later launch might have found the Zeros back at altitude, the hangar decks clear, the carriers in a less vulnerable state. After the battle, when Hiryu's aircraft had hit the Yorktown and Spruance had to decide whether to pursue Yamamoto's retreating fleet with his surviving carriers, he made the equally correct decision to not pursue. He held his force back, correctly calculating that Yamamoto's battleship fleet was still intact and that a night surface engagement would favor the Japanese. He refused to be drawn into the decisive battle that Yamamoto had designed the whole operation to provoke. He preserved his carriers. He declined every gamble that wasn't necessary. He won. Spruance would go on to command at the Philippine Sea in 1944, where his conservative approach again frustrated colleagues who wanted more aggressive pursuit of a retreating Japanese force, and again proved strategically sound. He is, in the professional judgment of most serious naval historians, the finest American admiral of the Pacific War. He was not a charismatic figure. He left no memorable quotations. He wrote no dramatic memoirs. He gave almost no interviews. He simply made the right decision at every critical juncture. Chapter 26. The Japanese after Midway. Concealment and Consequences. The immediate Japanese response to Midway was concealment. The survivors of the carrier crews were quarantined on their ships, and then in isolated barracks when they returned to Japan. They were not allowed to communicate with their families or with other military personnel about what had happened. The official announcement minimized the losses
and claimed significant American damage in return. The quarantine was not primarily about preventing enemy intelligence from learning what had happened. The Americans already knew. It was about preventing the Japanese public and military establishment from learning the true scale of the disaster. The crew survivors were held in isolation for weeks.
Some of them remained isolated for months. The official deception was maintained at a cost to the men themselves. They could not be debriefed openly, could not share their experiences, could not process collectively what they had been through. The wounded from the carriers were treated in hospital facilities separated from the regular military hospitals, their injuries attributed to other causes in the official records. The 4 carriers were listed as operational in some Japanese naval planning documents for months after their sinking, creating a phantom fleet of assets the commanders were still referencing when they should have been updating their order of battle. The concealment created its own second-order costs. Japanese planning for subsequent operations proceeded on the basis of an incomplete and distorted assessment of the fleet's actual strength. Resources were allocated, operations were designed, timetables were constructed against a background of imperfect information about what had been lost. An empire trying to maintain morale through concealment of a disaster had to conceal the disaster from the planners who needed to know about it in order to plan accurately. The consequences of this distortion ran through Japanese strategic planning for months after June 1942. Chapter 27. The Guadalcanal Connection. The Battle of Midway was followed 6 weeks later by the American landing on Guadalcanal, a decision that Nimitz made partly because Midway had changed the strategic calculus of the Pacific War. Before Midway, a major amphibious offensive in the South Pacific would have been dangerously exposed to Japanese carrier air power. After Midway, the reduced Japanese carrier capability made an offensive in the Solomons operationally feasible, dangerous, contested, costly, but feasible. The connection between Midway and Guadalcanal is therefore direct and causal. Without the intelligence victory at Midway,
Without the destruction of 4 Japanese carriers in one morning, the Guadalcanal campaign might not have been launched when it was, or on the terms that it was. The strategic offensive that eventually carried American forces from Guadalcanal to the Philippines to the Japanese home islands might have been delayed by months or years. Guadalcanal was its own brutal campaign. 6 months of combat on the island and in the waters around it, with losses on both sides that were comparable in their scale and brutality to major European engagements. But it was an offensive campaign, and the American capacity to take the offensive in mid-1942 was a direct consequence of what had happened at Midway 6 weeks earlier. The cascade of consequences from one intelligence assessment, confirmed by a fake water shortage message, building through Nimitz's decision to commit his carriers, through Spruance's decision to launch at maximum range, through McCluskey's decision to extend his search when the carriers weren't where he expected. That cascade reaches forward through Guadalcanal and the Solomons campaign, and the island hopping, and the Philippine Sea, and Iwo Jima and Okinawa, to the ultimate end of the Pacific War. It all begins on June 4, 1942. It all begins with Rochefort's intelligence and Nimitz's courage, and Waldron's sacrifice, and McCluskey's navigation. It begins, in a sense, in the basement in Pearl Harbor, where a man in a smoking jacket and carpet slippers had been reading the Japanese Navy's mail for months. Chapter 28. The Historical Verdict. The Battle of Midway has been analyzed, debated, reanalyzed, and debated again for 80 years. Every decision has been examined. Every alternative has been considered.
The historiography of the battle is one of the richest in Second World War studies, encompassing official histories, personal memoirs, unit records, Japanese naval archives, and the intelligence records that became available after declassification.
The consensus that has emerged from this long analytical process can be stated simply. Midway was decided by intelligence before the first aircraft launched. Every other factor, tactical skill, aircraft performance, damage control, command decisions, weather, timing, luck, operated within a framework that intelligence had built. The framework gave American commanders the ability to position their forces correctly. Without that positioning, the tactical factors might not have been sufficient. With it, they were. The alternative history of Midway, the battle as it might have been fought without Rochefort's intelligence, is a battle in which American carriers are south or west of their actual positions, responding to Japanese moves rather than anticipating them. In that battle, the Kido Butai has the initiative and the numbers. In that battle, June 4, 1942, might look very different. Rochefort's intelligence changed the nature of the battle before it began. Nimitz's decision to trust the intelligence and commit the carriers transformed a possible ambush into an executed ambush. Waldron's torpedo attack created the conditions for McCluskey's dive bombers. McCluskey's navigation and decision to extend his search found the carriers. The dive bomber pilots executed one of the most precise and devastating air attacks in naval history. Every element was necessary. None of it was sufficient alone. The Battle of Midway was won by a system, an integrated combination of intelligence, command decision, tactical execution, and individual sacrifice that no single component could have produced. It was won, at the deepest level, by America's ability to build that system faster and better than Japan could counter it. Which is exactly how the Battle of the Atlantic was won on the other side of the world in the same year. The two great naval turning points of the Second World War, Midway in June 1942 and Black May in May 1943, were both, at their core, intelligence victories. Both resulted from an enemy's communications being compromised. Both were concealed from the enemy whose communications were being read. Both changed the direction of their respective wars. The symmetry is almost too clean for history, but it is real. Chapter 29. What Nagumo Knew and When. A question that has never been fully answered in the historical record is what Nagumo himself understood about why Midway happened the way it did. He survived the battle. He gave testimony in the official investigation. He commanded in subsequent engagements. He wrote after-action reports. None of these documents contain a clear statement that he believed the Americans had advanced knowledge of the operation. The official Japanese explanation, better enemy reconnaissance, possible submarine scouting, coincidental timing, is what Nagumo would have been expected to put in his official reports, regardless of what he privately believed. The culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy and the specific circumstances of Midway's aftermath, with its careful management of public information, would have made it difficult for any senior officer to state in writing that Japanese operational security had been compromised. What Nagumo thought privately is harder to determine. There are accounts, reconstructed from the recollections of staff officers who survived the war and were interviewed by historians decades later, suggesting that Nagumo believed the American carrier positioning was too precise to be accidental, that the attack timing, arriving exactly when the Japanese fighter cover was at low altitude, exactly when the hangar decks were in the worst possible state, was more consistent with prior knowledge than with lucky coincidence. If he believed this, he did not put it in any document that survived. He may have understood, in the days after the battle, what the pattern meant. He may have seen the shape of what Berger would see 14 months later in the North Atlantic, the moment when accumulated evidence points to only one conclusion, and the conclusion is that the enemy has been inside your communications. If he saw that shape, he died with it. Chapter 30. The Last Hours of the Carriers. The 4 carriers that were sunk at Midway did not die quickly. Akagi was struck at 10:26 and burned through the day and into the evening. Her crew was evacuated, her damage control parties fighting the fires until it became clear that fighting was futile. She was finally sunk by Japanese destroyers in the early hours of June 5th, a mercy killing, to prevent the shameful possibility of a Japanese carrier being captured by the enemy. She went down at 0500 local time. Kaga burned through the afternoon, her fires reaching her fuel and ammunition stores in a series of massive secondary explosions that threw debris hundreds of feet in the air and were visible from other ships miles away. She sank at 19:25 on June 4th, the first of the 4 to go under. Soryu sank at 19:13, minutes before Kaga, her fires having reached the magazines in a final catastrophic explosion. Hiryu, which had survived the morning's attack and launched her counterstrikes against the Yorktown, was found by Enterprise dive bombers at 17:03 and struck by 4 bombs in a pattern that left her burning as completely as her sisters. She burned through the night and sank the following morning. The men trapped below decks on the burning carriers, engineers and damage control parties, and wounded men in the medical spaces, died with their ships. Some were killed instantly by bomb explosions or secondary detonations. Some burned. Some drowned as the ships went under. The total Japanese dead at Midway was approximately 3,057 men. More than 100 of them were the most experienced naval aviators in the Japanese service, men who had been training since the mid-1930s, whose skills and experience were irreplaceable on any reasonable timeline. They died in an ambush they never knew was an ambush. Chapter 31. The Intelligence Legacy of Midway. The intelligence achievement that produced the Midway ambush left a legacy that extended far beyond the Pacific War. Station Hypo and its successor organizations continued reading Japanese communications throughout the war, providing intelligence that shaped every major American operation, from Guadalcanal to the Philippines. In April 1943, Station Hypo decrypted an itinerary message revealing Admiral Yamamoto's planned inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. American P-38 fighters, flying a precisely calculated interception, shot down Yamamoto's transport aircraft over Bougainville Island. The ambush that had begun at Midway claimed its greatest individual victim 14 months later. The broader legacy was institutional. The American signals intelligence apparatus that had won Midway became, after the war, the foundation of the National Security Agency, the most capable signals intelligence organization in human history. The techniques, the culture, the organizational principles, and the technical expertise developed during the Pacific War's code-breaking operations survived the war and were institutionalized in the post-war intelligence structure. The Midway victory demonstrated, in the most compelling possible terms, that signals intelligence could be strategically decisive.
This demonstration shaped American defense investment and organization for the entire Cold War period and beyond. The investment in codebreaking that Rochefort represented, the institutional willingness to fund, staff, and support cryptanalytic operations, proved to be among the highest return investments in American military history. One basement in Pearl Harbor, one group of mathematicians and linguists in carpet slippers, one fake water shortage message.
One battle decided before it began. The intelligence legacy of Midway runs straight from June 1942 to the present day. Chapter 32. George Gay, the last man from VT-8. George Gay survived by accident. His aircraft were shot down during the torpedo attack, but he managed to keep his head above water by hiding under a floating seat cushion when Japanese aircraft passed low overhead, not wanting to attract attention. He floated in the Pacific for 30 hours, watching the battle unfold above and around him. He watched the Japanese carriers burn. He watched the smoke rise from what he knew from his briefings were the ships that his squadron had been trying to hit. He had not hit them. No torpedo from VT-8 had found its mark. The hits had been scored by the dive bombers who had arrived after the Japanese fighters were too low and too scattered to stop them. He floated in the Pacific and understood, in the way that survivors understand things, that the deaths of his 29 crewmates had contributed to what he could see burning on the horizon. He was rescued the following morning. He spent the rest of the war in a second-line assignment, his physical and psychological state making front-line flying inadvisable. He became, in the years after the war, one of the primary witnesses to what Torpedo Squadron 8 had done and what it had cost. He spoke about it for decades. He talked to historians, to students, to anyone who wanted to understand what Midway had looked like from 30 feet above the water, with no fighter escort and 30 Zero fighters coming down. He said in one interview late in his life, "We knew we weren't coming back. I think most of us knew before we launched. But the carriers had to be stopped. And if we could draw those Zeros down low enough for the dive bombers to get through, then it was worth it." He paused. I thought about whether it was worth it for 40 years. The answer has to be yes. It has to be. Because otherwise, what does it mean? He died in 1994. He was the last survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8. Chapter 33. The Pacific's New Reality. After June 4, 1942, the Pacific War entered a new phase. The phase was not immediately obvious. The battles continued. The islands were still defended. Japanese soldiers and sailors still fought with the commitment and skill that had characterized them since December 1941. The exchange of losses continued to be brutal. But the direction had changed. Before Midway, Japan had the strategic initiative. It chose where to attack, when to attack, and on what terms. The Allies reacted. American and Australian forces scrambled to defend positions that Japan had selected as targets. After Midway, the initiative began to shift, slowly, unevenly, not in a clean transition from one phase to another, but in the messy, overlapping way that strategic shifts actually happen. Contested at every point, disputed in every engagement, but moving in one direction. The direction was toward Japan. Guadalcanal came next, then the Solomons, then New Guinea, then the Central Pacific, then the Philippines, then Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The road from Pearl Harbor to the Japanese surrender on September 2, 1945,
a road measured in millions of dead and 3 years of combat across the largest ocean on Earth, runs through Midway. It runs through the basement in Pearl Harbor where Rochefort worked. It runs through the flight deck of the Enterprise where McCluskey launched. It runs through the water north of Midway where George Gay floated under his seat cushion, watching carriers burn. It runs through the bridge of Nagata where Nagumo stood and understood, too late, that the battle wasn't a battle. Chapter 34. What Nagumo Said to Kusaka. The exchange between Nagumo and his chief of staff Kusaka aboard Nagata has been reconstructed from Kusaka's post-war testimony.
Kusaka survived the war and was interviewed extensively by both Japanese and American historians in the years after the surrender. His account of the battle and its immediate aftermath is one of the primary sources for understanding what the Japanese Carrier Command experienced on June 4th. What he described of Nagumo in the hours after the initial attack was not the collapse of a broken man, but the silence of a man who had understood something that could not be undone. Nagumo functioned. He gave orders. He received reports. He continued to exercise command over what remained. He'd use counterattacks, the destroyer screens, the surface fleet that was still intact. But something in his manner had changed between the bridge of Akagi and the bridge of Nagata. Kusaka described it as, he was still the admiral, but he was no longer the victor. The confidence that 7 months of unbroken victory had built, the professional assurance of a commander whose forces had met every enemy and beaten every enemy, had been not eroded, but removed, all at once. In the 6 minutes it took 3 carriers to become fires on the Pacific horizon. The question Kusaka said Nagumo asked, quietly, was not about tactics or rearming decisions or fighter cover. It was, how did they know where to find us? He never received a satisfactory answer. He died on Saipan 2 years later without knowing. The answer was Rochefort. The answer was JN-25. The answer was a fake water shortage message and a basement in Pearl Harbor, and a man in a smoking jacket who had been reading his fleet's communications for months. The battle wasn't a battle. It was an ambush. And the ambush had been built before Nagumo left Japan. Chapter 35. The Memorial at Midway. Midway Atoll today is a wildlife refuge, home to the largest albatross colony in the world, a place of extraordinary natural quiet that gives no immediate indication of the violence that occurred in the air and on the water around it. There is a small memorial. It marks the turning point of the Pacific War. The albatrosses that nest on the atoll, hundreds of thousands of them, going about their slow, graceful, completely indifferent lives, were here before the battle and here after it, and they will be here long after the memorial itself has become indistinct. The men who died here left no permanent mark on the landscape. What they left is more abstract and more lasting. They left the direction of the war. They left the Pacific on a trajectory that, however slowly and painfully, and at whatever additional cost, led toward the end of a conflict that had begun with a surprise attack on a Sunday morning in December and was decided by an ambush on a Tuesday morning in June. They left George Gay floating under a seat cushion. They left Rochefort in a basement reading messages that would save the Pacific. They left Nimitz with the intelligence that made the ambush possible. They left Nagumo standing on a cruiser's bridge asking a question he would never have answered. They left the albatrosses undisturbed. Chapter 36. The Final Reckoning. The Battle of Midway was decided in the interval
between Yamamoto's operational orders leaving his flagship and Rochefort's team reading them in Pearl Harbor. It was decided in the time it took Nimitz to study the intelligence assessment and say, "Close enough." It was decided in the moment Waldron led his squadron into the guns of the Japanese Combat Air Patrol. It was decided in the moment McCluskey turned northeast to extend his search when the carriers weren't where he expected. It was decided in the 6 minutes between 10:25 and 10:31 on June 4, 1942. In those 6 minutes, the Pacific War turned. Not because of tactics alone, not because of bravery alone, not because of sacrifice alone, because of a system, an integrated combination of intelligence, decision, tactics,
and sacrifice that no single component could have produced, and that all components were necessary to deliver. Nagumo stood on Nagata's bridge and looked at 3 burning carriers and asked how the Americans had known. He was asking the wrong question. The right question was not how the Americans had known. The right question was how Japan had allowed them to know. The answer was in the radio traffic Japan had been transmitting across the Pacific for months. The answer was in the detailed operational communications that had coordinated the Midway operation across hundreds of ships and thousands of miles. The answer was in every message that Yamamoto's staff had transmitted to every unit and every force component of the most complex naval operation Japan had ever attempted. Every one of those messages had been an opportunity. Rochefort's team had taken the opportunities. The ambush had been built one intercepted message at a time. And on June 4, 1942, it was sprung. The battle was over before it began. Epilogue: The Admiral Who Never Knew. Chuichi Nagumo died on Saipan in July 1944 without knowing what had really happened at Midway. He died believing, probably, that better American reconnaissance had detected his approach, that a combination of luck and tactical flexibility had allowed the American carriers to be in position, that the timing of the dive bomber attack had been a coincidence of extraordinary misfortune, his aircraft in the worst possible state at the worst possible moment by a series of circumstances that another set of decisions might have prevented. He died not knowing about Station Hypo, not knowing about Rochefort, not knowing about the AF deception, not knowing that Nimitz had the composition of his fleet, the timing of his approach, and his attack plan 3 weeks before he left Japan. He died not knowing that the battle wasn't a battle. He deserved to know. Not because the knowledge would have changed anything. Saipan was falling regardless, and the Pacific War's outcome had been determined long before July 1944. But because a man who made a profession of understanding warfare, who devoted his life to the practice of naval combat, who commanded the greatest carrier strike force in the history of naval warfare, that man deserved to understand what had happened to him. He didn't get that. He got instead the silence of a Japanese military establishment that could not admit what had happened without admitting that everything it had built its planning on was compromised. The silence was its own kind of defeat, different from the tactical defeat at Midway, but related to it in the way that all the failures of Japanese strategic culture in the Second World War were related. The inability to confront bad news, the preference for a comfortable fiction over a difficult truth, the organizational resistance to the kind of self-examination that might have revealed the communications compromise and saved the lives of the men who died because it was not revealed. Nagumo asked how the Americans had known where to find his fleet. The Japanese Navy never answered the question. The answer was waiting in a basement in Pearl Harbor. It would not be formally confirmed until the 1970s,
when the American government declassified the intelligence records of the Pacific War, and the full story of what Rochefort's team had done became part of the public historical record. By then, everyone who had been on the bridge of Nagara that morning was long dead. The albatrosses still nest on Midway. The Pacific still spreads west from Hawaii for thousands of miles. And somewhere in the deep water north of that small atoll, in the crushing darkness at the bottom of the ocean, 4 Japanese carriers rest on the sea floor. They have been there since June 1942.
They will be there long after every memorial and every archive and every book that carries their names has turned to dust. The battle they lost was decided before it started, by a man in a smoking jacket and carpet slippers, in a basement in Pearl Harbor, reading their mail.